And we're fine. I know the exhibition is kicking off around 8 o'clock, but it's there until 10, so I think we can spend a little time chewing the fat on what I find very interesting about Mike's talk, and also Ambar's. We can talk all we want about community and diversity, but if the structure's not in place, or the structure's not going to help you to achieve your aims, whatever they might be, then you're not going to get anywhere. So we might want to think about those sort of institutional aspects as well. But please, I'll throw it completely open. That was just my initial thought, I suppose. Do we have any questions or comments for any of the panel?
Now, question, John?
I was just going to say, despite the fact that I don't really support, the conservative nature of the whole CYBC infrastructure and the Republic's take on radio and whatnot, but is it at fault as well with the countries that sort of have larger populations of Cypriots that have left Cyprus that sort of really crave this stereotype? I know growing up outside of Cyprus, and knowing that large community we had, we would have done anything to get Rick, even 5 minutes just to listen to a radio broadcast. Isn't that stereotype still sort of being perpetuated in these countries with these populations? Do you think that they still crave it, and therefore that need brings about this homogenous continuity? Is that not something?
I think it's a generational thing partly. Sort of, say 30 years ago, I had a late uncle who lived in Liverpool, for example. When I was first on CYBC being interviewed, he was listening to me in London. The interview was about 11 o'clock at night, because that's the time they interview reggae musicians, I guess. And he was listening to me something really ridiculous, like, if it was being replayed at 4 o'clock in the morning Liverpool time. And he stayed up all night after he closed his chip shop just to hear his nephew being interviewed on CYBC. And when I went to Liverpool to see him, he said to him, "But I do this every week. I phone up." And the presenter, a bloke called Yorgoudis, who many of you might remember him, Yorgoudis actually used to present this show on CYBC at that time. He told me, "Yeah, this guy phones me up every week. Well, he's my uncle, I think the generational thing comes into it. But what's changing in a lot of the diasporic communities around the world, with second, third generations, and to a large extent, a station like London Greek Radio adapted to it in a very crude way. I remember 20 years ago, you couldn't play a record on there in the English language. It was just not permitted, mainly because people got too upset. They would get 2 complaints and say, right, we won't play no English language music anymore, by Cypriots, including George Michael, who's half Cypriot, right? So what do they do now? If you tune into London Greek Radio now, I'd say at least 80% of the language is in English. Most of the people that are of a certain age can't really speak very good English, radio English, so it sounds very forced to me to hear some guys speaking, trying to make it sound like LBC, but hasn't got a clue about talk radio. So he's completely uneducated on how to do a talk show. So it's an interesting time in that sense, and the whole perspective is changing. And it's also about where you're from, and it's always been this case. It's also about where you're from, but it's also about where you're at. So people have been making music in societies throughout the UK that has reflected their background, but also reflected their neighbourhood or reflected what's going on around them. And to a large extent, this music was ignored by the community media like LGR until they finally realised, but that's our audience, so we have to play it. And I experienced this very firsthand as an artist as well, in terms of censorship. But when I came to Cyprus and my songs were played and everyone really liked them, they started playing them in London. So it was a bit of an ironic twist to the tale, But I think the whole process of change, of transformation, I don't want to use the word assimilation because it always makes me feel very uncomfortable. But the whole process of people just changing is inevitable, you know. The third, fourth generations of Cypriots in the UK will probably know 2 words in Greek or 2 words in Turkish, you know, and they might be yes and no in both languages, you know.
If I could sort of reframe that question slightly to open it out. Elizabeth spoke about looking at Cyprus as an emigrant community. Now that we do have that returning communities from, you know, huge diasporas around the world, and Ambar, I'll open this up to you as well. You would have thought on the face of it that would increase diversity, you know, exposure to different cultures from Canada to Australia, but does that seem to be the case, or will the shift from an emigrant community to a returning community make any difference in terms of this issue of diversity?
I think one of the things that really happens, in at least in my experience with the fine arts here, because I'm really involved in the idea of how do you craft a Cypriot art student. You know, what is a Cypriot? Yeah. I mean, like, what does it mean to have a fine arts program here? Well, I think it's really important because what's been happening over the years is that people travel. I mean, I'm looking at Emin, and I know you've spent so many years and been educated outside of Cyprus, and I think most artists have had this experience. So it's not just the returning Cypriots, but it's also that artists in general have been sent away for art education, and then they come back. Well, I mean, maybe that's really important to do. I mean, it's always important to me, I think one of the most exciting things about tradition is that it really pops out and it stands out when you're in contrast with something else that's different. So I think probably the foreign experience is probably really valuable in that respect. To bring back then and to keep growing, that's the challenge, I think. And I don't know that many artists who have left Cyprus and who came back. I think they have a pretty good time when they leave. Visual artists, I mean.
Yeah. Yes, but like what in the section when they were talking about poetry as well, and the idea that, you know, the way how do you start kind of imagining, or how do you start actually all of us have been, let's say quite a lot of us have been educated abroad, and we have brought in a lot of things with us when we're coming back, and to look back at your own society and think that you're actually going to be very original with it is kind of not very easy, because you're bringing all sorts of structures from abroad, like what we're talking about when I was talking about importing the word diversity or multiculturalism and so on. Those are all important words, but what do we do with it? And how do we raise awareness from within that word? Okay, we import it, but then how do we actually go back to our own ways of thinking, and how do we actually see the original from this island? And how in poetry, for example, Molaskas was talking about how people were going back into nature and talking about nature and so on and so. But then that also becomes very artificial, because they start sprinkling words like you're saying, like, okay, you know, Aphrodite and this and that, and again we're falling back into the same ideologically loaded sort of concept. So it's not very easy to do that, but the fact that if we are, for example, the reason that I actually spoke more about the concept of diversity and multiculturalism today was because this was the first diversity arts festival. So, and then, but in your introduction you were talking about how you're going to have a multiculturalism seminar or something later on in November. And that's a contradiction in itself in terms of how these terminologies are being imported into our language, and then we're not thinking about them, is what I'm actually concerned about. Mm-hmm. Because when we talk about diversity, for example, here, and we're talking about only Turkish and Greek, I mean, this is not the case. I mean, this island is not just Turkish and Greek. This is number one. Number two is it's not about just Turkish language or Christianity and Islam. There are lots of other things which has come through here for thousands of years. But we're selecting. We're deciding, okay, we came with the Minoans, we came with the Ottomans, we came with this, and then we decide to see who we are just in those terms. And that's so small, such a small part of culture is what I was talking about, you know. If we were to think about this island as a whole, what do we have as always that we had is this little island, really, with its nature and whatever passed through it. And so diversity, we could take diversity as a term, as a very positive term, and talk about diversity in that sense, what has come through. And how can we take away all our boundaries, you know, because politicians are not going to do that. So we might as well intellectually do it, you know, and do it through arts and culture. Get rid of all the boundaries and start re-looking at what we have. And this is what I was talking about. So immigrants to me are no different than who we are because we were once immigrants. And so when do you decide who was first, who was second, or when they were talking about Istanbul, the occupied Istanbul and occupied Famagusta, it's ridiculous today to think about it that way because who occupied what first, who cares? You know, what we have now is this. And we're all, you know, human beings and we're all living here and we're thinking about things now. Why do we keep going back to these boundaries and just like restricting culture with that? And so that's talk about Aphrodite means, you know, we care about our culture. It's ridiculous, is what I think.
If I could relate your question to music, then certainly the diasporic people from different communities around the world, is how I'll use the term, had a very big influence on especially club culture.
Okay, the returnees, as it were.
Yeah,
Right.
and also from a very long time ago and from a very young age. And I've studied this in relation to hip-hop music. The first people to do hip-hop music effectively were actually doing it in English in Cyprus. And you can trace that back. It's actually a
No,
very...
are you sure? I just read an article that said it happened in Brooklyn. I'm sorry, in a
No,
basement.
no,
One
in
particular
Cyprus,
party.
in
No,
Cyprus,
one
I think.
party in Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn, that's
Later-
where it started, yeah.
Thank you.
But it actually started from the griots in Africa, but that's another story.
No,
But
just today.
there is you can trace it back, you know, to the 1980s, early 1990s, where even people at the age of 14 were DJing in clubs like Africana, who were actually British Cypriots, who'd returned with their families, but they were playing hip-hop music, or they were playing R&B music, or they were playing reggae music. And at the time, this was sort of like, what is this stuff you're playing? And then 5 years later, you found a lot of Cypriots actually playing this music and also making this music in Greek or in the Cypriot dialect. So the communities
is
from abroad
something-
actually brought the music that they were into as part of where it was at for them in places like London,
This
New
is
York,
something that's interesting, though.
Canada.
There's like this edge of validity, like what's valid. You know, it takes a little while for something to be valid.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I think, that's a really interesting
But these places were very marginal.
tipping point, yeah.
Is there another question? Back there as
Well,
well.
I just
Or comment.
I just wanted to say, I mean, we're talking about communities coming back from abroad and whatnot. Don't mind my skepticism, but a metaphor would be akin to having, you know, somebody coming back with all the enthusiasm in the world, whether they're artists or not, back to Cyprus, and you know, you're just this little potted plant, and you end up hitting the ground, and you've got a bulldozer of dirt that just covers you up for multiple summers and winters, and you just pray you just get a leaf right out into the sun. Because that's probably the best I can, and I'm just speaking from experience.
You're talking about the media, though, aren't you?
So yeah, but I think that's the battle right there, and I'm skeptical about that impact as well, because you know, I mean, by the time you actually get out to that surface, I mean, I'm just not sure how much that community at the end of the day is making.
Don't take what I just said. Don't take it wrong. I'm not talking about communities. I'm talking about individuals from a diasporic background who came back and were very marginalised. Even today, are very marginalised. So, at the time, the popular thing to do in a club was called face control. Emwareski fatsazo. You don't get in, you know. And this was I experienced this firsthand at the time, you know, because of the clothes I was wearing.
And another comment about that? Thanks, Paul.
It's really interesting hearing about borders of validity and face control, and I'm thinking about othering. Sometimes when we figure out how people otherize, sorry for making up words, but you know what I mean? Well, this is it, it's language.
Yeah.
Sometimes we create words and we don't have the words, but we're trying to conceptualize processes that we can't really tangibly see. And so there may be, if we can sort of explore a bit of how we create the other person, the other, whether it's through religion, race, or whatever, or nationality, that can sort of illuminate a lot of our understanding in the sociologically.
Yeah, totally agree.
But I think also the othering comes in this discussion of validity, and John, your sort of beautiful analogy of what it's like to come back to Cyprus as a Cypriot. I can shine a small light on this as coming to Cyprus as a non-Cypriot person. I didn't pay attention to anything. I paid attention to no rules. I had no idea that what I was doing wrong. I still don't. Sometimes I know when I'm doing stuff that's not right, like I shouldn't tease a priest, that kind of thing, but I still do it anyway because I just can't see the point. Now, when I go back to the States, I get buried by similar things as well. So I think that there's this othering happens by this master narrative somehow that Stavros talks about. Well, whatever type of it's a social master narrative that is filled with cues that Cypriots of both sides of the island are very familiar with. I think, or I don't like to talk about sides of the island, but both communities are probably very familiar with, because there's like this informed structure of how people are supposed to be with each other. It's a small society. If you don't know those cues, Cyprus is a great free place to be.
Bull in a china shop.
Yeah, I mean,
It's the best way.
Well, I think on that note, we're going to have to wrap it up. And thank you all very much, both to the three facing you, and to remember Stavros and George Maleskis from earlier on as well. Thank you all very much.